Greetings, friends. It's me, Wayman, and this is a video reviewing the book Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium by Bart Ehrman. This was put out in 1999, a little bit old, and if you've got a hold of this book, you will not need the book, Did Jesus Exist? Because Bart Ehrman covers almost everything in this book as he did in Did Jesus Exist?, the newer book that came out, other than his responses to the mythological scholars and mythic point of view. But this was a pretty good book. It took him 128 pages to get going, because what he does is just covers Jesus in general, what scholars think about him, and he gives some sources about Jesus before he starts constructing his hypothesis about Jesus being a apocalyptic prophet. And it's quite interesting. So just reading a few of the headings of the chapter. Chapter 1, the end of history as we know it. Who was Jesus? Why it's so hard to know. So he goes in this intro, as I said before, 128 pages, snooze. How did the Gospels get to be this way? Looking around a bit, non-Christian sources for the historical Jesus. Looking around a bit more, other Christian sources for historical Jesus. Moving on to the past, how can we construct the life of Jesus? Finding a fit in Jesus in context. He's a Vermees, did quite a few of these books, Jesus as the Jew. Sometimes it's really hard to place Jesus in context, because what you find is the biblical scholars themselves making Jesus into themselves, which is fascinating, because they will write and they will steer the arguments and hypotheses towards whatever cultural or political thinking sometimes, or theological thinking sometimes, and Jesus was made into bazillions of different things. And we still continue to do that today. When we read the biblical literature, we always insert ourselves in it. So it's really, really tough to get a good view of that. So finally, chapter 8, he starts Jesus and the apocalyptic prophet. Chapter 9, apocalyptic teachings of Jesus, and so on and so forth. It's 14 chapters. I'm not going to read them all, but you can go through that. And it was an interesting read, because Bart Ehrman separates out the message of Jesus and then talks about the message about Jesus, which started with some of the early Christianities. So in the last video with Ehrman, some people wrote in, wait a minute, what are you doing, blah, blah, blah. I usually try not to believe anything, and everything falls on the spectrum, and you have plus or minus 5%. So you have the bell curve, and so I'm open to almost anything and reading about almost anything. And just because I happen to discuss a book doesn't mean I totally agree with it. And I know that Bart Ehrman isn't perfect, and he ducks and dodges and rolls just like everybody else. And there are some arguments out there that are very good. One of them being Caesar's Messiah by Joseph Atwell, which Ehrman did not discuss in his book, Did Jesus Exist? A lot of scholars might think that these people are crockpots, and they shouldn't be listened to. However, they do bring up some really good points that land someplace on that spectrum. Maybe half would be out, but still some of them will land within that zone of being acceptable. And that's what you have to do with almost every scholar. And then some scholars surprise us with new theories and lay out their argument much better than others. So am I biased towards Ehrman in the good way? Yes. Simply because I've been listening to his stuff for about 10 years now. 10 years. And I remember listening to his lectures, 24 lectures on who was Jesus and early Christianity from the Teaching Company. And also, I've been studying and reading a lot of his textbooks and things like that he wrote, and they're very enjoyable. So Bart Ehrman basically, and a few others, taught me early Christianity, and I really liked Ehrman because he was an agnostic. However, he still has some fundamentalist tendencies of his past that he seems to be trying to shake. So he'll get there. So I guess apologetics usually makes my blood pressure go up, because sometimes people mix the historical and the theological together, and I think that's why Bart has a hard time with some readers and the view, because he's talking about the historical, but for the apologist, the theology influenced the historical, and when you try to separate the two with belief systems, it's very hard to do because there's certain facts that are considered historical, but they're really theological and theologically bent. So like the soteriology of Jesus, or salvation, or apocalypticism, or Christology, all that is piled on to historical Jesus, to whatever flavor of denomination you might be a part of. So that's why a lot of people say, Wayman, how do I how do I handle all this? Well, I want to know personally all about it. So I read lots of different materials. And this book, even though I've read quite a few Ehrman's books, it's basically a repeat until page 128. And there's a lot of other good books on apocalypticism in the early Christian movements out there, because the whole thing, basically from the writings of Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, all the way up through even today, they're fighting anti-assimilation, and they're talking in apocalyptic terms. Christianity definitely, just like Judaism fought Hellenism, definitely Judaism is still fighting Christianity. And just like they would not bow to Hellenism during the reign of King Antiochus, they would not bow to Christianity. So that's why you get a lot of the retaliation from the Jewish community. I understand that. The Dead Sea Scrolls, Flusser wrote a really good book, Qumran and Apocalypticism, of the Second Temple period. Maybe I'll post a link to that. That was a very good book, because it showed how a lot of these apocalyptic movements sprang up. And also the text of Josephus, where he lists a bunch of apocalyptic prophets coming up, getting a huge gathering and a huge following, and end up getting devoured and destroyed by the Roman government. Crushed them, elbow from the sky, boom. So I think that today, in texts on apocalypticism, and even in the secular community, we have environmental apocalypticism, we have economic apocalypticism, political apocalypticism, that may not have anything to do with belief system, but people see this terrible end coming and this huge change coming, and they're prepping for it, like preppers, doomsday preppers, all those different things. Even people in the economic side of it, I just seen a post on how Germany's people are giving all their money, the rich, to Germany to just hang on to, because they're afraid of losing it in case of an economic downturn. So, people are constantly prepping for this. And I think that Jesus, in some ways, when he had the Sermon on the Mount, was prepping people. And so that continues. And fear and uncertainty always, and forced assimilation, all those different things, always inflames apocalypticism, and because we're unsure of the future, both in the secular and in the religious. So, good book, buy it and read half of it, or get it on interlibrary loan if you don't want to pay for stuff that you've already read. If you read some of Bart's later books, you might not need this one. Just read from, the chapters that are relevant, because he does a lot of repeating in a lot of his books, and he tries to aim his books towards the general public. So for all those who were, going on about that Jesus exists for real stuff, relax. I listen to a lot of stuff. I read a lot of other books, and I'm going to be getting into some other books just as soon as I'm done reading another book on apocalypticism, anti-Semitism, and in Judaism. towards Judaism among scholars, especially during World War II and a lot of those World War I and II, and a lot of those scholars coming out of Germany. How did all that affect scholarship and the way we view biblical literature now, and what were they doing, and were they projecting their own views on the literature? So it's a good book overall, but save your money if you want to get it on interlibrary loan. But the study of apocalypticism is very fascinating to me. So take care, friends, and remember, if everybody's thinking alike, then somebody isn't thinking.